I'm Dan Williams with Davey Resource Group, and we need to do here. There we go. So we're talking about wildfires and habitat management for utilities, and I'm going to be kicking it off and kind of setting the table as we talk about it, and then turn it over to Jack, and he's going to take it from there. The focus we're going to bring to is on the vegetation management side of things as opposed to the habitat side of things. I think there's probably at least one whole detailed session on how habitats respond to fire. So we thought for the purposes of today, we'd talk about what we're hearing from folks out there, practitioners out in the field. And we touched on that a little bit earlier today in a couple of different places. How do we make sure that we're bridging the gap between the science, the environmental science, the actual planning, and the physical work that's being done out there. I think that's probably just as important as making sure we've got the right soil, the right site preparation, all those other things. Get this going the right way. Yeah, so this is a picture of the U.S. There's any number of sites out there that identify how many fires are burning at any given time and any given day. The folks from DRG, don't tell my wife that I said there's nothing special about the 14th of February, but that was the day I started this presentation. And you can see that these are major fires burning. If you query another site that's looking for a little bit different things, Florida will show up on fire as well. So fire is a constant, and it's a normal thing. And fire is part of the natural landscape, as we all know. A lot of different ecosystems that these rights-of-way cross. Many of those ecosystems, particularly out in the West, really depend on fire to help make things happen for them. Those rights-of-way exist within that ecosystem, and one of the things that, of course, we all know is that what happens on either side of the right-of-way just as important as what happens on the right-of-way. And if you're talking about an ecosystem that depends on response to fires naturally, well, as things change, fires happen. If they're magnified by man-made actions, by climate change, different consequences can happen. So to that end, this is a map that the EPA generated looking at mid-21st century and end of 21st century, and you can see the changes in the amount of acres burned. There's a lot more red and yellow side of that graphic than blue. So things are changing. They're changing rapidly. That has consequences. From a planning standpoint, how do you anticipate what these changes in the burn are going to mean for your management? And then you're also dealing with historical practices. There's a lot of momentum behind the system that you're operating within in your organization. Climate change is also throwing other challenges at you in terms of the pests, the drought on the right-of-way that actually promotes buildup of fuels. You've got land use regulations that probably are not up to speed. We've seen most recently what's been happening out in the West in communities. It's a really tough situation for them. And then at the end of the day, as you're dealing with more frequent incidents, that's competing for the resources that you would have hopefully been able to put towards the recovery later. And Jack's going to talk about that a little bit in terms of the type of recovery that we really want to be aiming for.
Good afternoon. As Dan said, my name's Jack McCabe, and we're going to throw a little bit of DOT in here as well, even though it said this is for utilities. This is a scenic highway in California. It's a project that we did to help mitigate dead disease, dying trees as a result of the 5-year drought in California. But from a user point of view, this is a road you want to drive with the convertible top down, right? This is something that's beautiful. From a fuel load management point of view, or from a vegetation management point of view, it's a nightmare. Beyond the considerations that traditional DOT managers need to take care of, clearances, safety hazards, and other risks, in the West with fire, they've got to be concerned about the highways themselves, the right-of-way, being a source for wildfire. The car fire that happened in Northern California last year was caused by a car pulling a trailer with a flat tire, and that rim created sparks, which started a huge catastrophic fire around Redding, California. Beyond that, we had a major catastrophic fire in 2017, the Camp Fire, that resulted, they're still investigating the cause. However, many of the people killed were stuck on a highway trying to evacuate. So that's one of the things that DOT managers are now looking at is how do you create defensible space around the highway so that you can use it as an evacuation point for many of the communities that have now built up into the wildland urban interface. And then when you do have fires, a manager's got to be concerned about erosion, whether it's roadside soils or it's around culverts or creek crossings. They need to be, the potential for erosion that happens after a fire has the potential to undermine the highway itself. On the utility side, here's a pretty typical mountain transmission right-of-way. This is actually a federal right-of-way, Western Energy Power Authority. You can see they've got that wire zone, border zone taken care of. So from a reliability point of view and from a compliance point of view, this is somewhat considered to be an ideal right-of-way. The focus, again, is on regulatory compliance, meeting clearance standards, and then looking at risk management. So identifying trees that could fall in either from within the right-of-way or outside the right-of-way. Oops, I lost my slide. The risk management side is probably the biggest driver in the West, knowing that you've got millions of trees adjacent or outside the right-of-way that could fall into or essentially fall into the power lines and ignite a fire is kind of the biggest concern that a right-of-way manager has. We're there. For the fires that could start outside the right-of-way, they're concerned about protecting their assets, and they're concerned about reliability. A lot of vegetation beneath the lines, particularly with transmission. If it creates a lot of smoke, it could create a carbon path that would cause those power lines to essentially arc to ground and create an outage. One thing to keep in mind is from a transmission or from an electric utility point of view, sometimes the types of vegetation that are considered poor habitat, invasive weeds, are the ones that actually are going to keep the woodies out. And they're going to have less fuel load in the right-of-way. So, there's a inherent conflict between habitat and their concerns with regard to wildfire. And then, we've got a slide with showing that there is recovery. How you manage recovery depends on whether it's a natural environment considered natural or if it's something that's been actively managed before the fire. Intensity of fire will have a huge impact on how the natural systems recover. Again, erosion control and site disturbance will impact what comes back after the fire. And then, regular, consistent management. I think that's a theme I've heard several times today. In the case of fuel loads, if you don't go in and manage afterwards, you're going to have just as big a fuel load problem in 10 years than if you didn't have the fire in the first place. That's all I got.